On a misty morning in St. Mary Mead, a single curious incident on the village green shatters the calm of everyday life. A treasured object goes missing, a stranger is seen at dawn, and a harmless quarrel suddenly seems full of secrets. While the villagers whisper and speculate, only one woman watches quietly from her rose-fringed window, the elderly Miss Marple, whose sharp eyes notice what others overlook. As small clues hide in teacups, knitting baskets, and polite conversations, she begins to unravel a mystery that grows far larger than anyone suspects. And it all began with a single ordinary morning. Chapter 1. A quiet village morning turns curious. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with the soft, pearly glow that always seemed to suit the village best. Gentle, unhurried, and full of the small domestic sounds that formed the quiet heartbeat of rural English life. Birds chattered from the hedgerows, the milkman rattled his bottles along the lane, and the chimneys of the thatched cottages breathed thin ribbons of silver smoke into the crisp air. It was, in every sense, the kind of morning that promised nothing more eventful than a polite exchange at the grocer's or a mild quarrel over hymn selections for Sunday service. And yet, as often happened in such places, the most extraordinary events began on the most ordinary of days. Miss Jane Marple, silver-haired, mild-eyed, and wrapped in a soft pink shawl of her own careful knitting, sat by her window overlooking the village green. To the casual observer, she might have appeared dozing, her needlework resting untouched on her lap. But her blue eyes were alert, quietly taking in every movement beyond the lace curtains. Miss Marple's attention seldom wandered, and never without reason. Years of observing human nature, particularly in small communities where nothing remained private for long, had taught her that small details had a curious way of blossoming into significant revelations. On this particular morning, her gaze drifted toward the center of the village green, where a curious shape lay half hidden in the grass, something small, dark, and out of place in the otherwise immaculate scene. A scattering of dew sparkled across its surface, suggesting it had been dropped during the early hours, well before the villagers were up and about. Miss Marple hesitated, frowning slightly, then reached for her spectacles. The object remained indistinct from her window, but its presence was unmistakably peculiar. St. Mary Mead was not a village where things were left lying about, and the positioning, just at the base of the old oak tree where the benches circled, struck her as even more unusual. Before she could ponder further, footsteps sounded along the path. "Morning, Miss Marple," called Mr. Arthur Hewitt, the village postmaster, his breath misting as he crossed toward the green. A stout man with a mustache that quivered when he spoke, Mr. Hewitt was rarely the first to rise, and Miss Marple noted this deviation with a mental underline. She smiled back, raising a hand. "Good morning, Mr. Hewitt. Out rather early today, aren't you?" He paused, almost startled, before laughing in a forced manner. "Just, couldn't sleep. Thought I'd open the post office a bit sooner than usual." Miss Marple's intuition tingled. Mr. Hewitt had never in his life opened early. One could set a clock by his habits. His eyes darted to the mysterious object by the oak tree. The mustache twitched. "Odd bit of rubbish someone's dropped," he muttered, tone a shade too casual. "Youngsters, no doubt." Miss Marple's expression softened further, as if indulging a child. "Indeed, though one doesn't often see youngsters out at dawn." Mr. Hewitt swallowed, pretended not to hear, and hurried off toward the high street. Miss Marple watched his retreating back, her mind quietly arranging the small details into their places like neat stitches on a sampler. The next arrival was Mrs. Edith Colchester, wife of the retired naval commander and unquestionably one of the village's most enthusiastic gossips. She marched across the green with the purposefulness of a woman who had urgent opinions to deliver. Her wide-brimmed hat bobbed with each step. "Miss Marple," she cried without looking up at the window. "I shall be writing to the parish council, mark my words. First it was that dreadful business with the misplaced garden tools, and now there is litter here of all places." Miss Marple leaned slightly out of the window. "A most distressing sight, I agree," she said. "Though I don't believe it is litter, Mrs. Colchester." Mrs. Colchester paused mid-stride, turning toward the object. Her eyes widened. "Good heavens! Is that— Why, that looks like— No, it couldn't be," Miss Marple ventured. "It rather resembles a glove, does it not?" "A glove?" Mrs. Colchester huffed. "Not just any glove. That looks very much like one of Mrs. Ellingham's black kid leather gloves. She's always waving them about at committee meetings as though she were conducting an orchestra." Miss Marple considered. "Mrs. Ellingham was at the Women's Institute gathering last evening. I noticed she wore a pair of beige gloves then." Mrs. Colchester deflated slightly. "Well, someone's glove at any rate." She approached it tentatively, then recoiled. "Oh, it's damp, horrid thing. Who would drop a perfectly good glove right here?" The answer, Miss Marple suspected, was someone who had been in quite a hurry, or someone who did not want to be seen leaving it. Mrs. Colchester, fussing and muttering, finally drifted away, likely in search of someone else to alarm. Miss Marple, after watching 2 more villagers pass by without noticing the object, finally rose with the stiff, careful grace of someone long accustomed to concealing aches. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, took up her walking cane, used more for appearance than necessity, and stepped outdoors. The morning air greeted her with brisk delight. Crossing the lane, she knelt beside the object. It was indeed a glove, fine black kid leather, beautifully stitched, and unmistakably of high quality. But that wasn't what caught Miss Marple's attention. On the wrist, faint but visible, was a monogram. E.E. Miss Emily Ellingham. But Mrs. Ellingham had worn beige gloves the previous night. So when and why had she lost this one? Miss Marple lifted it delicately, examining the inside. A faint but distinct scent lingered. Not perfume, but something sharp and chemical. Something she recognized from her days assisting the vicar's wife with parish inventories long ago. Typewriter ink. How curious. Footsteps approached, and Miss Marple straightened slowly, turning to see Colonel Arthur Colchester, husband to the gossiping Edith, and a man with an expression permanently stuck between pride and irritation. "Miss Marple," he barked, "Edith informs me there is suspicious debris on the green." Miss Marple, holding the glove delicately, smiled. "Not debris, Colonel. Something rather more personal." He squinted. "A glove? Rubbish. Someone dropped it. Nothing suspicious about that." "Oh, but perhaps there is," Miss Marple said mildly. "It belongs to Mrs. Ellingham." "The dashing widow?" The Colonel sniffed. "She misplaces things constantly, always rushing about, quite irresponsible." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet, one does not typically misplace a single glove on one's way across the village green at dawn." The Colonel harumphed but said nothing more. Miss Marple slipped the glove into her pocket. Something was beginning. Something small, yes, but undeniably significant. As she turned to head home, a figure appeared at the far end of the lane. Miss Emily Ellingham herself. She moved briskly, her dark coat buttoned high against the chill, her posture elegant but tense, as though she feared being late for something important. Spotting Miss Marple, she lifted her hand in greeting, but it was a bare hand. No gloves. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she called, voice unnaturally bright. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Quite," Miss Marple replied softly. "Though I fear you may have lost something valuable." Miss Ellingham's expression flickered, just for a second before settling into polite calm. "Oh? Whatever do you mean?" Miss Marple reached into her pocket and withdrew the glove. Miss Ellingham froze. Then, placing a hand delicately at her throat, she forced a slight laugh. My glove. Oh dear, I must have dropped it last evening. On the green? Miss Marple asked pleasantly. At some rather early hour? Early hour? Miss Ellingham repeated too quickly. Well, I suppose I may have crossed here after the meeting. It was quite dark. Miss Marple saw it. The twitch, the hesitation, the very human flicker of instinctive concealment. I found it damp with dew, Miss Marple said gently. So it must have been there some hours. Miss Ellingham's composure faltered further. Yes, well, mist collects quickly on leather, you know. But thank you, Miss Marple. You always notice things others miss. Her tone held a faint edge, half admiration, half unease. She accepted the glove, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Miss Marple, calm as ever, offered a soft smile. A pleasure, my dear. But as she watched Miss Ellingham hurry away, clutching the glove as though it might betray some secret, she knew, beyond doubt, that there was more here than a mere lost accessory. And the village, though still unaware, was on the cusp of a mystery that would stir every teacup and knitting circle in St. Mary Mead. Later that morning, the air buzzed with whispers. As Miss Marple made her way to the grocer's, phrases drifted past her like snippets of an overheard wireless program. Saw lights in the post office after closing. Stranger at the inn, didn't give his real name. Mrs. Ellingham looked pale as paper. Something's amiss, I tell you. Miss Marple listened politely, her mind weaving the threads together. Inside the grocer's, Mr. Wilkins greeted her with an anxious smile. Morning, Miss Marple. Quite the stir today, eh? Gloves appearing in odd places, lights flickering where they shouldn't. Makes one wonder. It is peculiar, Miss Marple agreed. Have you seen Mrs. Ellingham today? Mr. Wilkins blinked. She came by early, bought a large amount of stationery, odd for her. Said she needed to write letters. Letters? Miss Marple murmured. How industrious. Mr. Wilkins nodded earnestly. And she wasn't wearing gloves at all. Strange for someone who never goes out without them. Not strange, Miss Marple thought. Calculated. As she exited the shop, the church bells chimed, their mellow tones gliding across the rooftops. Miss Marple paused, watching the villagers scatter along their errands, each unaware that the simplest details, the absence of gloves, the early morning restlessness, the scent of ink, were forming a pattern. And patterns, Miss Marple knew, always led somewhere. That afternoon she returned to her window, knitting in hand. The village green looked peaceful once more, but the tranquility was deceptive. A shadow crossed the far side of the lane. A man tall, thin, and unfamiliar in St. Mary Mead. He paused at the old oak tree, glanced about furtively, then knelt as though searching for something. Miss Marple's needles stilled. He stood after a moment frowning, and strode away with stiff urgency. Miss Marple allowed herself a tight, thoughtful sigh. The glove was not a lost item. It was a signal, or perhaps the remnant of a hurried encounter. Miss Ellingham's lie, Mr. Hewitt's early start, the stranger's search. They were all pieces of a puzzle just beginning to reveal its frame. And in St. Mary Mead, puzzles never remained unsolved for long. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple took a gentle stroll around the green. The air held the faint scent of wood smoke and clipped hedges. Lamps flickered on one by one, casting warm islands of light along the pathways. She paused beneath the oak tree, fingertips brushing the grass where the glove had been. No other objects lay hidden, no other clues at first glance. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust first glances. Her gaze drifted downward, and there, almost invisible in the fading light, lay a tiny scrap of paper, curled and damp. She bent carefully and picked it up. The paper bore a smudge of ink as though once typed. But most of the text was lost. Only 2 words remained legible. The ledger. Miss Marple's breath caught ever so slightly. A ledger? From the post office? The Women's Institute? Or perhaps something far more private? Whatever its origin, the scrap confirmed her certainty. Something significant had transpired on the green before dawn, and it was no mere village mischief. Cradling the damp paper, Miss Marple turned toward home, the warm glow of her window beckoning. As she stepped inside, she whispered to herself, "Where there is a ledger, there is often an account kept, and someone who does not wish it to be found." Miss Marple placed the scrap beside her teacup, her mind already arranging the first outlines of the mystery to come. St. Mary Mead's quiet charm remained unbroken on the surface, but underneath threads of intrigue were pulling tight. And Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and sharp mind, was ready to follow every one of them. Chapter 2. Conversations over teacups. Morning in St. Mary Mead rarely passed without some meaningful exchange conducted over a cup of tea. The village seemed built upon such rituals. The pouring of hot water, the clink of porcelain, the soft murmur of confidences shared between sips. By late morning, Miss Marple found herself engaged in precisely that tradition. Seated in the warm, sunlit drawing room of Mrs. Florence Pierce, one of the vicarage's most dedicated helpers, and an invaluable source of information on matters both trivial and pressing. Mrs. Pierce, a plump and good-hearted woman with a tendency to speak in breathless bursts, poured the tea with her usual enthusiasm. Such excitement on the village green today. Edith Colchester has half the village convinced that a crime has occurred. She's going about saying she felt danger in the air. Honestly, Edith always feels danger, usually when there's nothing else to talk about. Miss Marple smiled politely and accepted her teacup. She had long ago learned that even the most exaggerated village gossip contained at least a sliver of truth. Mrs. Pierce leaned forward. "Do you think the glove means anything, Miss Marple? Edith says it's a sign of—" "Oh, what was the phrase she used?" "Unsavory behavior." Miss Marple stirred her tea serenely. "One never knows, my dear. Sometimes people drop things quite innocently. Other times, well, objects can find themselves in peculiar places for very precise reasons." Mrs. Pierce shivered, delighted by the suggestion. "And Mrs. Ellingham, my goodness, I saw her at the baker's not an hour ago. She looked positively rattled, ordered 2 loaves and a dozen buns, then forgot them entirely when she left. Mr. Bullen had to chase after her." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "How unusual. Mrs. Ellingham is typically very composed." "Exactly," Mrs. Pierce said triumphantly, as though she herself had unraveled the beginning of the mystery. "Which leads me to wonder, what was she doing out so early? Edith claims she saw Emily returning home at sunrise." "Sunrise? That woman is never awake before 8. Miss Marple hid a smile behind her teacup. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Pierce said eagerly. "And the most curious part, she was walking from the direction of the post office, not the green." Miss Marple's fingers paused ever so slightly on her teacup. "The post office?" Mrs. Pierce nodded with vigorous certainty. "Arthur Hewitt, of course, insists he saw nothing at all. But Arthur would deny an earthquake if he feared being asked to sweep up after it." True enough, Miss Marple thought. Mrs. Pierce continued, "I wonder if she had urgent correspondence, though Emily Ellingham has never struck me as a woman fond of writing letters. She always says conversation is far more efficient. Of course, she only says that after spreading every word she heard across the entire town." Miss Marple listened thoughtfully, letting the chatter wash over her. Mrs. Pierce's observations, exaggerated though they might be, were pieces of the puzzle. Emily Ellingham at the post office at dawn. Arthur Hewitt awake unusually early. Ink on the glove, and a stranger searching the green. Mrs. Pierce, Miss Marple said gently. Have you heard anything about a stranger staying at the inn? Mrs. Pierce blinked, surprised by the change of subject. A stranger? I don't believe— Oh, wait. Mrs. Hartley did mention seeing a gentleman checking in last night. Tall, thin, pale as milk. Looked like he'd stepped off a London train after a sleepless night. Did he give a name? Something beginning with R. I think Mrs. Hartley said Reeves. Or Reevely. No, it might have been Rexford. She wasn't sure. He signed the guest book in a terrible rush. Miss Marple sipped her tea, mind quietly sorting the information. A rushed signature, a dawn visit to the green, searching for the glove or something else that had vanished. Mrs. Pierce lowered her voice. Do you suppose he could be connected to this business with Mrs. Ellingham? Miss Marple responded with her usual gentleness. I would not dream of assuming, my dear. But sometimes strangers arrive in villages for very particular reasons. Mrs. Pierce's eyes widened. Oh, like in those detective stories, where the outsider hides a dreadful secret? Miss Marple smiled diplomatically. Not always dreadful, but secrets do tend to travel. Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow walk from the vicarage to the high street, pausing occasionally to observe small details. Scuff marks in the dirt road, faint footprints near the post office, and the lingering scent of typewriter ink that drifted from an open window above the shop. Inside the post office, Arthur Hewitt was busy pretending to reorganize his shelves. He looked up with a forced cheerfulness that Miss Marple found quite suspicious. Miss Marple, twice in one day? To what do I owe the pleasure? I merely wanted to post a letter, Mr. Hewitt, Miss Marple said, handing him an empty addressed envelope. She often kept one handy for precisely these occasions. I noticed you were open earlier than usual this morning. Arthur chuckled in a manner too tight, too rehearsed. Yes, well, couldn't sleep, you know. Thought I might as well start the day early. Miss Marple nodded, pretending not to notice his trembling hand as he stamped her letter. Quite understandable. Though one rarely sees you about before 8:30, he swallowed. Well, one has to make exceptions. Miss Marple let the silence hang gently between them, observing how Mr. Hewitt's eyes darted repeatedly toward the back room. I hear Mrs. Ellingham passed through early as well, Miss Marple said casually. Mr. Hewitt stiffened. Did she? I didn't notice. Must have been busy sorting parcels. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, though I believe she was quite eager to find something. Perhaps a letter mislaid? Mr. Hewitt nearly dropped the stamp pad. I really wouldn't know. Miss Marple's calm voice softened even further. Oh, of course. But I do hope no important documents went missing. Such things can be terribly inconvenient. He nodded too quickly. Yes, terribly. Miss Marple gave a gentle, understanding smile and turned to leave. Do take care, Mr. Hewitt. It would be dreadful if any misunderstanding occurred. The postmaster let out a breath only after she had walked fully outside. Miss Marple continued down the lane, the afternoon sun warm on her shawl. She did not need confession, she rarely did. The tiny cracks in people's expressions were often more revealing than the words they attempted to hide behind. As she approached the village inn, the Blue Sparrow, she slowed. Mrs. Hartley, the innkeeper's wife, stood on the doorstep, polishing the brass handle with unusual vigor. Good afternoon, Mrs. Hartley, Miss Marple greeted. Oh, Miss Marple, you won't believe the trouble I've had today. That new guest of ours, Mr. Reeves or something, left his room. In a dreadful hurry, didn't even stay for breakfast. Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her. Is that so? Yes. And what's more, he asked me, well, quietly, mind you, if anything had been found on the green. something he claimed he'd lost while walking last night. "Oh?" Miss Marple asked softly. "And did he describe this something?" "Not exactly, just said it was personal and important. He was terribly agitated." Miss Marple's mind clicked neatly into place. A personal, important item, presumably dropped, presumably sought again at dawn. "Did he say whether he found it?" she asked. Mrs. Hartley shook her head. "He left before midday looking positively upset, carried a small case no heavier than when he arrived, so he had not retrieved whatever he was searching for." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Hartley and continued her walk, deep in thought. If Emily Ellingham had found the item first, whatever it was, then her early morning panic made perfect sense. And if Mr. Hewitt had known something about it, and if the scrap of paper referring to the ledger had been torn from a note or document, a picture was beginning to form, faint but distinct. Miss Marple returned home just past 3. As she prepared her afternoon tea, Earl Grey with the faintest hint of bergamot, she heard a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Emily Ellingham herself standing on the step, clutching her gloves, both gloves tightly in one hand. "Miss Marple," Emily said quickly, her usually smooth voice wavering. "May I come in? I need to speak with you." Miss Marple stepped aside. "Of course, my dear." Emily entered, pacing a little before finally settling on the armchair near the fireplace. "I must ask you," she said, please do not mention finding my glove, not to the Colonel, not to Edith, not to anyone." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle curiosity. "If it troubles you so, my dear, perhaps you might explain why you were out so very early this morning." Emily's shoulders sagged. Her eyes shone with a complex mixture of fear, guilt, and fatigue. "I can't tell you everything," she whispered. "Not yet. But I swear to you the glove was dropped by accident. I only stepped out because I needed to look for something." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Something someone else dropped?" Emily's lips parted, but she stopped herself. I shouldn't say. It isn't safe." "Safe?" Miss Marple echoed lightly. "In St. Mary Mead?" Emily looked away. "I didn't think such things could happen here, but they have. And now I don't know where to turn." Miss Marple reached for her hand gently. "My dear, I assure you, whatever is troubling you, it is always best faced with clarity and reason. Secrets only grow heavier when we attempt to carry them alone." Emily swallowed hard. "I'm afraid I may be found in possession of something that doesn't belong to me, something dangerous." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Dangerous?" Emily nodded. "Yes. And if the wrong person discovers it is missing?" She shuddered. "I don't know what will happen." Miss Marple's voice remained perfectly calm. "My dear, you are not in any immediate danger, but if something was dropped and if you retrieved it, perhaps you should let me help you understand its significance." Emily hesitated, long, tense, uncertain. Finally she whispered, "I found a page torn from a ledger. I don't know what the ledger is or who it belongs to, but the page listed several names, and next to some of them were amounts." Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill run through her, not of excitement, but of recognition. "A ledger," she said softly. "That explains a great deal." Emily held her gloves tighter. "Miss Marple, please tell me honestly, do you think someone would hurt me to retrieve it?" Miss Marple's expression remained gentle but firm. "I think, my dear," she said once, "that someone is very anxious to resist discovery, and that means we must proceed with great care." Emily looked up, fear sharp in her eyes. Miss Marple offered her a reassuring smile. "Do not worry. Villages have secrets, yes, but they also have ways of revealing the truth. and with a few more conversations over a few more cups of tea we shall uncover precisely what happened on that green." Emily let out a shaky breath. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." Miss Marple patted her hand. "That is what neighbors are for." As Emily prepared to leave, Miss Marple added quietly, "And do keep that ledger page somewhere very safe. I have a feeling someone will be looking for it." Emily nodded, pale and breathless, then slipped out the door. When she was gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair, folded her hands, and allowed her thoughts to settle. A ledger with names, a stranger in the village, a missing page, ink on a glove, a dawn search, and villagers behaving rather unlike themselves. The mystery was no longer forming. It had taken its first clear shape, and Miss Marple, with her keen mind sharpened by years of watching human behavior, was ready for the next step. Chapter 3. The Echoes Inside the Walls. The night settled over the mansion like a tightening grip, squeezing the last traces of warmth from the corridors. Azan stood in the dimly lit hall, staring at the wall where he had discovered the hidden symbols, a line of ancient markings that made his skin prickle every time he glanced at them. The air itself seemed charged, as if the house had inhaled sharply and forgotten how to exhale. A faint tapping echoed from somewhere above, not loud, not urgent, but rhythmic, slow, deliberate, too intentional to be ignored. Tap, tap, tap. Azan lifted the lantern he now carried everywhere and followed the sound. His footsteps echoed softly as he moved down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was old, yes, but not this alive. He paused at the staircase, listening again. The tapping had grown clearer now, like fingers drumming on wood. He swallowed, gathering courage, and climbed the stairs. At the top, the temperature dropped sharply, cold enough to make him wrap his arms around himself. The hallway stretched long and silent, lit only by the trembling flame of his lantern. This part of the mansion was unused. Padlocked rooms, dusty floors, and dark corners that seemed to swallow light. The tapping stopped. Azan held his breath. Then suddenly, tap, right behind the door directly in front of him. He reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold. With a shaking hand, he turned it. The door creaked open, releasing a long sigh into the hallway. The room was empty. Azan stepped inside cautiously. The lantern's glow swept across broken furniture, a collapsed bookshelf, and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. On the dusty floor, strange circular patterns were faintly visible, as though someone had drawn them and then tried to wipe them away. The room smelled faintly of burnt paper. Then Azan noticed something else. The tapping wasn't coming from the floor or the furniture. It was coming from inside the wall. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the wallpaper. The tapping continued, this time more urgently. Tap, 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 pause, tap. It was a pattern, a message. His pulse raced. He stepped back and searched the room for something, anything, to break through. Beneath the fallen bookshelf, he found a metal rod. He grabbed it, took a breath, and slammed it against the wall. The plaster cracked. He hit it again. On the third strike, a section of the wall caved inward, revealing a small, hollow compartment. Dust swirled into the air, making him cough. Inside the cavity lay a bundle wrapped in old cloth, tied with a string. Azan's hands trembled as he pulled it out. When he unwrapped the cloth, he found a leather-bound diary, dark, worn, and stained by time. His heart thudded. This house had secrets, and now he held one of them. He sat on the floor, opened the diary, and began to read the first page. If anyone ever finds this, know that this house is not cursed by spirit, but by its own memories. Azan felt a chill crawl up his spine. The next page was scribbled as if written in fear. They say walls listen. In this mansion they also speak, not with words but with sounds, taps, scratches, whispers bleeding through the plaster. I tried to ignore them, but they grew louder. He flipped the page, breath tightening. Tonight someone walked in the hallway. Though everyone else was asleep, their footsteps stopped outside my room. When I opened the door, no one was there, but the footprints remained. Azan froze. He slowly turned the lantern toward the dusty floor. Footprints, not his, not recent ones either. These were old, but clearly visible, leading toward the window and then circling back again. Who was the writer? Azan whispered. He returned his attention to the diary. There are passages behind the walls, old narrow tunnels built for reasons no one will explain. I followed the tapping once and saw a shadow moving behind the wooden planks. I thought it was a thief. I was wrong. Azan's throat tightened. He looked at the cracked mirror. In its reflection he could see the shadowy outline of the wall cavity, dark, narrow, like a secret mouth swallowing light. He turned another page. This house hides someone, or something. It watches, it listens, and it tries to communicate. He paused. The tapping had stopped completely. Silence swallowed the room again. The next line in the diary was jagged, as if written in panic. If the tapping stops, it means it has moved. Azan's breath hitched. Behind him a soft creak echoed, slow, heavy like a footstep pressed into old floorboards. He didn't move. Another creak. Someone was in the hallway. Azan closed the diary slowly, his fingers stiff. He stood, lifting the lantern. Light washed over the doorway and revealed nothing. He stepped out, looking left and right. The hallway was empty. Still. Too still. Then something caught his eye, a shadow stretching across the floor. But there was no one there to cast it. Azan's heartbeat thumped loudly in his ears. He took one cautious step forward. As he approached, the shadow faded slowly, dissolving like mist into the floorboards. He kneeled, touched the spot, but felt nothing unusual. The air grew colder. His mind raced. Is the house alive? Is someone inside the walls? Was it warning him or watching him? The diary felt heavier in his hand now, as if absorbing his fear. Azan hurried downstairs, lantern shaking. When he reached the main hall, he placed the diary on the table and leaned over it, trying to steady his breathing. He opened to the last page. It contained only 2 sentences. No matter what you hear, never trust the silence. And if you discover the truth, run. Azan stared at the words until they blurred. The tapping began again. Not from upstairs, not from the walls, but from directly behind him. Slow, deliberate, waiting. Tap, tap, tap. Azan turned around. The room was empty, but the lantern flickered violently, as if something unseen had just passed behind him. And then he saw it, on the far side of the hall. A shadow slipped silently into the darkness. Not human in shape, not entirely. Azan tightened his grip on the diary. Whatever was haunting this house, it wasn't done with him yet. Chapter 4, The Hidden Passage Beneath the Floor. The mansion seemed even larger in the early morning, its long corridors swallowing the dim light that crept through the windows. Azan hadn't slept, not after the tapping, not after the shadow. The diary lay open on the table, its pages curling from age and fear as if still breathing from the secrets it contained. He kept replaying the last words written inside it. If you discover the truth, run. Run from what? Azan rubbed his eyes and stood. The house was silent now, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt purposeful, like it was waiting for him to make the next move. He picked up the lantern again, though daylight had arrived. The light felt like his only weapon. He returned to the hallway where he had seen the shadow dissolve. On the floor, the patterns of dust had been disturbed, as if something heavy had moved across it during the night. but the prints didn't match footsteps. They looked more like long smears dragging marks as though someone had been pulled or had crawled across the floor. Azan knelt and touched the marks. The dust felt fresh, loosened recently. He followed the trail, which wound down the corridor and stopped abruptly near the old study room. Azan pushed the door open. The room was filled with antique furniture, cracked leather chairs, and shelves lined with books that had not been touched in years. The dragging mark ended in the center of the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. Azan stood still, listening, trying to sense anything out of place. A gust of cold air brushed against his ankle. He stepped back instinctively, then he crouched down again, placing his lantern close to the floor. A faint line ran through the wooden planks, a seam, almost invisible unless one was looking for it. Azan traced it with his finger. It extended across the entire room, forming a perfect rectangle. A trapdoor. His pulse quickened. He pushed the edges gently, but the panel didn't move. Searching around, he inspected the room until something on the wall caught his eye, a rusted metal hook behind a row of dusty coats. It was attached to a pulley system embedded into the wall. He pulled the hook. A loud click echoed through the room, followed by a deep rumbling beneath the wooden floorboards. The rectangular section shifted slightly, rising a centimeter before stopping. Azan wedged his fingers into the gap and lifted with all his strength. The wooden panel groaned open, revealing a pitch-black hole that breathed cold air upward. A staircase descended into the darkness. Azan swallowed hard. This was it. The secret the diary had hinted at. The passage behind the walls. The hidden paths built inside the mansion. Except this one led downward, not sideways. Lantern in hand, he stepped into the void. The wooden stairs creaked beneath his weight. Cobwebs brushed against his face. A damp smell filled the air, thick and earthy, like old soil and forgotten things. When he reached the bottom, the lantern illuminated a narrow stone corridor stretching both left and right. The walls were carved roughly, as if dug out by hand. The edges bore scratch marks, faint but unmistakable. Someone had clawed at them long ago. Azan chose the left path. His footsteps echoed softly and droplets of water pattered from the ceiling. After several meters, the corridor widened into a chamber. The lantern revealed a small table, a broken chair, and a notebook. Not the diary he found earlier. This one was newer. He approached slowly. The notebook was half open, its pages yellowed but not ancient. Azan picked it up and flipped through it. Drawings, maps, notes. Someone had been studying the house, recently. On one page, a sketch depicted the mansion's layout, but with hidden tunnels marked beneath it in red ink. Azan's breath caught in his throat. The tunnels spanned the entire property, branching like veins. Another page detailed something more alarming. Sublevel 3 not safe. Movement detected. Do not enter alone. Movement? Azan felt his skin crawl. There were more pages filled with notes. Footsteps at night, faint but constant. Scratching coming from the vents. Shadow sighted near the west hallway, not human. Then the last note. If anyone finds this, trust nothing in the dark tunnels. It mimics sounds. It follows tapping patterns. Azan stiffened. The tapping. His lantern flickered suddenly, dimming as though the air around him were thickening. Something shifted in the darkness behind him, a soft, sliding movement like fabric brushing stone. Azan turned quickly, raising the lantern, but the corridor was empty. He listened carefully. Nothing. He continued down the chamber, noticing another passage leading deeper. Against his better judgment, he stepped forward. The tunnel here was narrower. The scratches on the walls multiplied, becoming frantic, desperate. The air grew colder with each step. Azan tightened his grip on the lantern. Then he heard it. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. The same pattern from the upstairs room, but this time it wasn't coming from behind a wall, it was coming from the darkness ahead. Azan froze. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The tapping stopped. Silence. Then, a whisper. A soft, rasping whisper brushing against the stone. "Help!" Azan stumbled back, lantern shaking violently. The voice sounded human, broken, exhausted, but warped as if echoing from far away or from someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Please, help." Azan tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Another whisper. "Don't. Leave." He turned around, ready to retreat, but the tapping began again, this time from behind him. He spun, the lantern swinging wildly. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into shapes that dissolved when he tried to focus on them. He wasn't alone. Something was in the tunnels with him. And it was getting closer. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, coming from every direction. "Follow. Stay. Come closer. Don't run." Azan ran. He sprinted down the corridor, feet pounding against the stone, breath ragged. The lantern's flame almost died from the rush of air. He reached the stairs, climbed frantically, and shoved the trapdoor above him open. He burst back into the study room, slamming the wooden panel shut behind him. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping. Above him, the house stood silent again. But now he knew the truth. The tapping wasn't random. The shadows weren't illusions. Something lived beneath the mansion, and it wanted him to go back. Chapter 5. The Photographs That Shouldn't Exist. Azan didn't leave the study for nearly an hour. He sat with his back against the wall, knees pulled close, lantern flickering beside him. Every faint creak of the house made him flinch. Every brush of wind mimicked that whisper from the tunnels. Eventually, when his breathing steadied, he stood. He needed answers. The diary, the notebook, the tunnels beneath the mansion, the tapping, no longer random, no longer harmless. Someone had been down there before him. Someone who left warnings behind. Azan walked toward the living room where the morning light filtered through the tall windows, softening the shadows. He welcomed the warmth, anything that felt alive, but as he approached the fireplace, he noticed something strange. A frame on the mantelpiece was crooked. He was certain it hadn't been earlier. Azan reached out and straightened it, but the moment he touched the frame, his fingers froze. It wasn't dusty. Everything else in the mansion was coated in a thin layer of time. Furniture, shelves, windows. But this picture frame had been wiped recently. Cleaned, touched, handled. With growing unease, he lifted it. Inside was a photograph of the mansion's original inhabitants. Families from decades past, all standing in front of the main staircase. Their faces were formal, stiff, typical of old photographs. But something in the background caught Azan's eye. Behind the group, partially hidden by shadows, was the outline of someone standing in the upper hallway. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A tall, blurred figure. Azan brought the photograph closer. The figure's face was smudged, distorted, as if the camera refused to capture it clearly. But its posture, unnatural. Bent slightly forward, arms too long as if leaning over the railing, staring down at the family. He turned the frame around. Nothing on the back except a date. 1927. The last family portrait. Azan set the frame down carefully, his heartbeat rising again. He checked the adjacent photos. Another family image, another group portrait, another hallway background, and another blurred figure, not in the same place, moving closer. In one photo, it stood on the second-floor landing. In another, it stood halfway down the stairs. In the next, it was at the bottom step behind the family. The progression was impossible. The entity, if it was the same thing, was approaching. With each photograph through the years, it edged closer toward the people being captured. Azan felt a chill crawl up his spine. He spread the photographs across the table, arranging them chronologically. The evidence was undeniable. Each image captured a moment where this shadowy figure moved forward, creeping toward the center of the household. He reached for the final photo in the series. It was darker than the others. The lighting was poor, the faces even more serious. In this one, the family stood stiffly, but the atmosphere felt different, like fear was simmering beneath their forced expressions. Azan studied the background, his breath caught. The blurred figure wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was standing among the family members. Right behind the father's shoulder, its form was still distorted, its edges warping like smoke, but its height towered over the others. One elongated arm hung downward, almost brushing against the father's back. But the most disturbing detail: the father's shadow was wrong. It stretched unnaturally long and thin, as if meeting the blurred figure's shadow on the floor, merging with it. Azan stumbled back, knocking into the chair. The photographs fell, scattering across the rug. He pressed a hand to his forehead. Every passing minute inside this mansion peeled away a new layer of horror. Mystery, whispers, dragging marks, tunnels, and now, these impossible images. He needed to know more, and that meant searching the mansion's archive room. He retrieved his lantern, steeled himself, and headed down the hallway to the far wing of the house. The archive room was a small, cramped space stacked with boxes, old documents, and brittle papers. Dust motes floated in the air like drifting stars. Azan lifted the first box labeled Photographic Records. Inside were stacks of negatives, envelopes, and contact sheets. He sifted through them cautiously, careful not to damage the fragile materials. One envelope drew his attention, its edges torn, its label faded. Unsorted, do not display. His pulse quickened as he opened it. Inside were photographs far older than the ones he found on the mantel. Earlier families, earlier generations. But the same figure appeared again. Always blurred, always tall, always unnaturally bent, sometimes watching from a doorway, sometimes from the end of a hall, sometimes from the yard under a tree. Across decades, across different owners, different eras, the entity remained. Azan flipped to the last image in the unsorted pile. This one was the clearest, and the most terrifying. It was a photograph of a child's birthday gathering in the backyard. Balloons, a picnic blanket, the child grinning with a cake in front of him. Behind the child, standing silently near the old fountain. The same figure, but now the blur was sharper. The edges more defined, the shape unmistakably humanoid, as if it had been forming, solidifying over time, as if it had always been in the house, in the walls, in the tunnels, watching families come and go, waiting. Azan's stomach twisted. He placed the photograph down slowly, hands trembling. Why had no one mentioned this? Why were these photos hidden? Why had every family pretended nothing was wrong? Unless they hadn't survived to warn anyone. A faint, soft sound drifted into the room. A click, then another, then a slow, metallic wheeze like an old projector starting up. Azan turned his head sharply. At the far end of the archive room, the old film projector, one he hadn't touched, began to spin. Its reel turned, the bulb flickering to life all on its own. Azan felt his blood freeze, the image projected onto the empty wall. A grainy video began to play, silent, shaky. Azan recognized the scene immediately. It was the same birthday gathering from the photograph. But now it moved, children laughing silently, the father carrying a tray, the mother fixing ribbons on chairs. And then, at the edge of the frame, the tall figure stepped forward, not blurred, not hidden. It moved deliberately, slowly, purposefully. Toward the camera, the screen shook violently before the reel cut to static. Azan staggered back, heart slamming against his chest. He turned off the projector with trembling hands. Without warning, he felt a whisper against his ear. "You see it now." Azan dropped the lantern. The flame flickered wildly. He spun around. The archive room was empty, but the whispering wasn't gone. It was crawling through the walls, through the floors, through the tunnels, following him. Chapter 6. The room that locked itself. Azan backed out of the archive room, refusing to turn his back fully on the projector, even after he had shut it off. The lingering static in his ears made him feel as though the whisper still echoed behind him. He stepped into the hallway, chest rising and falling rapidly. The corridor, with its dim morning light creeping across the floorboards, felt safer than usual, though not truly safe. He had to get out, or at least reach the front door, breathe fresh air, and think clearly. He moved briskly toward the entrance hall, passing the tall grandfather clock, which ticked far slower than it should, as if the house's time was slipping behind the real world. When he reached the foyer, he grabbed the doorknob and twisted. It didn't budge. Azan frowned and tried again, harder this time. Still locked. He hadn't locked it. He stepped back, scanning the frame. No physical bolt, no chain latch, nothing that should have held the door shut. Yet it refused to move. Before he could try again, another sound froze him in place. Click. A soft, deliberate sound like a door latching somewhere else inside the mansion. Then another. Click, click, click. One after the other, doors closing up the hallway, locking themselves. Azan turned slowly toward the corridor he had come from. Each room, parlor, drawing room, study, dining hall, closed its door in sequence, trapping, the sound inside its frame like a breath held too long. The last door at the far end remained open, the guest room. Azan's heartbeat faltered. He remembered the guest room. He had never entered it. He never wanted to. Because the diary's earliest warnings had been written by someone who slept there. Someone who woke to tapping at their window every night. The tapping, the figure, the tunnels, the voice asking for help. Now that room's door remained open while everything else sealed itself shut behind him. It wasn't random. It wanted him to go there. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, I'm not going in there." Tap. Azan's fists clenched. The sound came again. Tap, tap. From the guest room. The same pattern, the same rhythm from the tunnels. He closed his eyes, willing himself to stay rooted in place. But some instinct, fear or curiosity or something darker, pulled him forward. He stepped into the corridor. His footsteps echoed lightly on the wooden floor as he approached the open room, each step accompanied by the faint trembling of the lantern he carried. The air grew colder the closer he moved. He stopped at the doorway. The guest room was dimly lit by a single window where pale sunlight streaked through sheer curtains. Dust danced in the beam of light. The bed was neatly made, the covers undisturbed. A writing desk sat in the corner, its surface covered in old letters and cracked ink bottles. But the window, Azan's eyes locked onto it. A handprint stained the glass. A long, thin handprint. Too long. Fresh. He stepped inside slowly, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. The moment he entered, the door slammed shut behind him. Azan spun around and grabbed the knob. Locked. The house had sealed him inside. He swallowed hard and turned back to the room. His eyes drifted toward the desk, where something small glinted beneath the dust. Carefully, he wiped the surface and uncovered a small key. Beside it, a note, not a letter, not part of the diary, something new. "If you find this room, you don't have much time." Azan felt his throat tighten. There was more written beneath, the ink smeared from what looked like tears or blood. "It comes through the floorboards first." A loud groan rumbled beneath his feet. Azan staggered back. No, not now, not here. The lantern flickered violently as something shifted under the wooden planks, warping the floorboards ever so slightly upward, as if something underneath was pushing against them. He ran to the wardrobe and pulled it open, hoping for another exit. But it was empty, except for a lone coat whose fabric was torn in long, uneven lines. Scratch marks. The floorboards groaned again, louder. Then, tap. Azan pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Tap, tap. The same pattern, the same message. It was beneath him. Trying to locate him, trying to speak, trying to lure him toward the center of the floor? Azan's mind raced. The note, the key. His eyes darted back to the writing desk. There was a small chest underneath it, something he hadn't noticed earlier. He dropped to his knees and pulled it out. It was locked, but the key on the table fit perfectly. He turned it with shaking hands. Inside was a small metal recorder, old but intact. He pressed play. A distorted voice crackled through the device, trembling with terror. If someone finds this, you have to know. It doesn't stay in the tunnels. It can move through the walls. Azan felt sweat trickle down his neck. And when it's close, it taps. It mimics us. It learns. The floorboard shuddered, harder this time. If it whispers to you, do not answer. Azan's breath hitched, but then the recording changed tone, becoming shaky, panicked. I think it's in the room. A loud crash erupted from the recording, followed by frantic breathing, the sound of furniture falling, and then the taps, tap, 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 tap. Then the recording ended abruptly. Silence. Azan's skin crawled. Something brushed the underside of the floor. The boards bulged upward by half an inch. He needed to get out, now. He grabbed the lantern and scanned the room desperately, and noticed something behind the curtains. A faint outline, a square shape, a second door, hidden. He ripped the curtains aside, revealing a small, narrow door in the wall, almost camouflaged with the paint. He grabbed the knob, locked. The small key didn't fit. He looked around frantically. Then he saw it, on the headboard of the bed, barely visible. A tiny, old-fashioned keyhole. He reached for the bed, pulled it slightly, and found a matching key taped beneath the frame. His hands shook violently as he unlocked the hidden door. The floorboards behind him cracked open with a sharp, splintering snap. Azan didn't look back. He shoved the door open and slipped through, slamming it shut behind him. Darkness swallowed him. But he was out of the room, out of the floor's reach. For now. He leaned against the cold wall, chest heaving, realizing something horrifying. The hidden passage he ran into. It didn't lead back into the hallway. It descended downward, back toward the tunnels, where the tapping began. Chapter 7. The Lantern in the Deep. The narrow passage was colder than anything Azan had felt above ground. The walls pressed close on either side, rough stones scraping his shoulders as he descended step by step. His lantern flickered violently, as if the air itself resisted light here. The staircase spiraled downward with no railing, only the sound of his own breathing echoing in the suffocating dark. Far above, the hidden door he'd slammed shut felt like the last thin string tying him to the safety of the world. He didn't look back. If he did, he feared he might see something filling the doorway. When his foot reached level ground, he paused. The air was damp, thick with old earth and disuse. But beneath the smell of wet stone there was something else. Burned wood, lantern smoke. Someone had recently been here. The passage opened into a long, low-ceilinged corridor, the same type of construction he'd seen during his first terrifying encounter in the tunnels. But now he wasn't wandering by accident. He was being guided, or chased. He held the lantern out in front of him, its trembling glow illuminating faint drag marks along the floor, fresh ones, leading deeper into the tunnel. Azan swallowed. The dragging pattern was uneven, like something being pulled, or someone trying to crawl. The temperature dropped again. His breath fogged. Something was here. He moved forward, refusing to let fear stop his steps. The tunnel turned sharply to the right, revealing a wider chamber lined with old, rotting crates and rusted pipes. In the center of the room stood something he didn't expect. Another lantern, lit, burning bright in the middle of the underground space. Someone else was here. Azan froze, listening. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. He stepped closer slowly, eyes scanning the darkness. The flame inside the lantern burned steady, not flickering, not struggling. A sign it had been lit recently by steady hands. He crouched to inspect it. The lantern was old but clean, not covered in dust like everything else. Someone had brought it down intentionally. Then he saw the note beneath it. A small scrap of paper folded once. His fingers hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, almost panicked. If you find my lantern, do not follow the voice, not even if it sounds like someone you know. Azan's pulse spiked. The voice from the tunnels, the whisper in the archive room, the warning in the recorder. If it whispers to you, do not answer. He looked around again, suddenly feeling watched. The chamber's shadows felt heavier now, as if pressing in from all sides. The crates, the pipes, the uneven stone, each seemed to shift subtly when he wasn't looking. He stepped back, clutching the note. A faint sound drifted through the corridor beyond the chamber. Not tapping, not footsteps. Crying, very soft, very human. Azan's heart clenched. "Hello?" he called before he could stop himself. The crying stopped instantly. He cursed himself silently. He had answered without thinking. A single whisper responded closer than before. "Azan." He staggered back, breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakable, his own name, spoken in the voice of his mother. He gripped the lantern tighter, shaking his head violently. "No. No, you're not real." "Azan, help me." A trembling, frail version of the voice he knew so well. He stepped backward into the chamber, lantern raised, eyes wide. "You're not real," he shouted into the darkness. The crying became laughter, soft, delighted, wrong. Azan spun and fled deeper into the tunnels, choosing the direction opposite the sound. His footsteps echoed wildly, but behind him, nothing. No pursuit, no tapping. No whisper, just silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was expectant. He reached another fork in the tunnel, two paths stretching into opposite darkness. One narrow, one wide, both equally uninviting. He scanned the ground for tracks, drag marks, faint but definitely present. Leading down the narrow passage, he hesitated. Following the marks had never brought him safety, but ignoring them had nearly trapped him upstairs. He whispered to himself, "You need answers, not escape." So he followed. The tunnel narrowed even more, the ceiling dipping so low he had to crouch. His lantern scraped the stone sometimes, throwing sparks. The air was so cold his fingers numbed, and then he reached a dead end, a wall of stone, solid, ancient, except the drag marks didn't stop at the wall. They went under it. Azan blinked. No, not under. Through. The bottom of the stone wall didn't meet the floor evenly. A narrow gap of darkness lay beneath it, barely the height of his hand. He lowered the lantern toward the gap. Something moved, not fast, not violent, just a slow, deliberate shift, like a figure crouched behind the wall, leaning closer to look back at him. Azan's breath turned shallow. A single whisper leaked through the gap. "Found. You." He staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern. The flame jumped high, threatening to go out. He turned, desperate to flee, and saw movement behind him. A shadow, tall, bending, arms too long, just like in the photographs. The lantern flickered violently as the silhouette stretched across the far wall, growing longer, deeper, reaching toward him. Azan! The voice didn't come from the shadow. It came from right beside his ear. He ran. He bolted down the tunnel, heart hammering like a drum in his chest, lungs burning in the freezing air. The shadow chased him, stretching unnaturally along the walls, its bent shape gliding instead of walking. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He didn't stop until he burst into another chamber, a circular room with ladders leading upward, old mining tools scattered across the floor, and a thick metal door embedded in the wall. He slammed the metal door behind him without thinking and twisted the wheel lock. The door clanged shut, echoing like thunder in the small space. Silence followed. Azan collapsed to his knees, gripping his lantern. Then he realized he hadn't noticed the room's most important detail. On the far wall, scratched deep into the stone in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Nothing that enters these tunnels is ever alone." Azan stared, breath shaking. Behind him, on the other side of the metal door, a soft, playful tapping began. Tap, 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 tap. It had found him again. Chapter 8. The Clue Hidden in Plain Sight. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet but unsettling discoveries, St. Mary Mead seemed draped in a thin veil of tension. Though the sun shone brightly across the rooftops and church steeple, a peculiar heaviness lingered in the air, as if the village itself sensed that the truth, long tucked into its comfortable corners, was preparing to step forward. Miss Marple set out early with her basket, though the contents were nothing more than a few knitted socks and a packet of tea she pretended she needed to post. Her true destination lay beyond the post office, the village green. She paused at the edge of the neatly trimmed grass and examined the ground with the same care a jeweler gives to diamonds. Her gloved hand brushed the earth lightly, her eyes darting between patches of disturbed soil, scraps of crushed clover and the fading marks of shoes that had passed in the early hours of the morning when the village still slept. The scene of the incident, where the mysterious wicker hamper had first been placed, appeared unchanged. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Crime often hid not in the dramatic but in the subtle. In St. Mary Mead, truth rarely shouted, it murmured. A soft cough behind her made her turn. It was Mrs. Weatherby, clutching her shopping bag and wearing an expression halfway between anticipation and dread. "Miss Marple, dear, are you out searching again? People will talk, you know." "People always talk, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said with a kindly smile. "I've long found it to be one of the village's more reliable characteristics." Mrs. Weatherby looked around nervously. "Well, yes, but this business with the hamper and now the missing ledger, oh, it's simply dreadful. They say the police think it might be connected." "Quite possibly," Miss Marple murmured. "But I often find that the most helpful part of an investigation is not what the police think, but what the villagers forget to mention." The woman's eyes fluttered. "Forget? Oh, I hope you're not looking at me when you say that." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Not at all. Though I wonder, did you happen to walk through the green yesterday morning? I recall your cat tends to wander off if you don't keep an eye on him." Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, then brightened. "Oh, yes, now that you mention it, I did pass through. Looking for marmalade. Naughty thing he is, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Not even someone in a hurry? Someone carrying something, perhaps a bundle or a book?" Mrs. Weatherby scrunched up her face in thought. "Well, now you say it. I did see young Mr. Ellison walking terribly briskly as though he had somewhere urgent to be. But that young man always moves as if he's late for something." "Did he have anything with him?" "A jacket slung over his arm, I think. Or perhaps I imagined it." She shook her head. Honestly, Miss Marple, I don't know how you keep all these little details straight. Practice, Miss Marple said, and a great many years observing human nature. Mrs. Weatherby hurried off, leaving Miss Marple alone once more. She turned her gaze back to the grass, and then she saw it. A tiny scrap of something sticking out from beneath the corner bench. Miss Marple crouched carefully. With a small pair of silver tweezers she always kept in her bag, she extracted the object. A thread. A very fine thread, pale gray-blue, no longer than an inch. Her lips pressed together in thought. She held it up to the morning light, watching it glimmer faintly. It was not from any garment she recognized around the village, too fine for the working men, too muted for the women's dresses, too delicate for ordinary coats. But she had seen that shade recently. Seen it and made a mental note at the time. A slow, thoughtful smile spread across her face. "Well," she murmured, "it appears our culprit is not quite as careful as they believed." The sound of footsteps made her straighten. It was Colonel Melrose, the village magistrate, striding toward her with purposeful energy. "Miss Marple, I was hoping to find you. The inspector seems convinced we're dealing with an outsider, some vagabond or vagrant passing through." Miss Marple tucked the thread safely into her handkerchief. "Outsiders are such convenient explanations, Colonel, especially when the truth is far more local." He frowned. "You think someone here, in the village, is responsible? I should be very surprised if they weren't." The colonel shifted uncomfortably. "This will cause a dreadful stir if it proves to be a villager." "Oh, I imagine it will," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "But better a stir than a false conclusion. May I ask, did the inspector mention anything about the footprints they found?" "Only that they were of an average size, nothing to distinguish them." Yes, that's rather what I expected." The colonel blinked. "Expected?" Miss Marple brushed a gloved hand across her skirt. "Human beings, Colonel, have a remarkable ability to disguise grand intentions behind ordinary shoes." That left the colonel blinking as she excused herself and headed toward the lane leading to Miss Prudence Hale's cottage. For when Miss Marple had first seen Miss Hale 2 days prior, standing in the vicarage garden, fidgeting with her shawl while claiming she had no earthly idea about the disruption on the green, Miss Marple had noticed the shawl's unusual color, a delicate gray blue woven in a pattern seldom found outside London boutiques. And Miss Prudence Hale was not the sort of woman to purchase such an item on a whim. When Miss Marple reached the hedge, she caught sight of Miss Hale's laundry line fluttering gently in the breeze. There, among the petticoats and bed linens, hung the shawl, missing a tiny frayed corner in exactly the place that matched the thread now tucked in Miss Marple's handkerchief. Miss Marple's eyes cooled, not with anger but with certainty. So, Miss Hale had indeed been on the green that morning. The question now was, why had she lied? And more importantly, what exactly had she taken, and for what purpose? Miss Marple lifted her chin. The time for quiet observation was nearly over. Sooner or later, the truth always stepped into the light. And Miss Hale, with her nervous air and far too delicate shawl, was about to become the focus of that light. Miss Marple walked back toward the village with steady, thoughtful steps. She had a thread, a lie, and a reason to suspect that Miss Hale's involvement ran deeper than a casual morning stroll. And now, finally, the mystery was beginning to turn in her favor. Chapter 9. The Truth Unveiled. The drawing room of the vicarage was quiet, almost too quiet. Outside, the gentle wind rustled through the trees, scattering the golden leaves across the garden. Inside, Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, hands folded neatly in her lap, the faintest crease of concentration on her brow. Across the room, the key suspects had gathered, summoned under the polite but firm insistence of the village detective. Colonel Melrose paced slowly, frowning, while Mrs. Weatherby fidgeted with her gloves, casting nervous glances toward the elderly lady detective. Even young Mr. Ellison, usually so composed, sat rigid, clearly unsure of what was to come. And of course Miss Prudence Hale remained perched on the edge of her chair, face pale, hands twisting the fringe of her shawl. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, the faintest sound carrying an authority no one would have expected from someone so gentle. "Thank you all for coming," she began. Her voice was warm, but there was no mistaking the sharpness beneath it. "I believe the time has come to speak plainly. All mysteries, however well hidden, have a way of revealing themselves, particularly in St. Mary Mead." A soft shuffling from Miss Hale drew the detective's eyes. The shawl draped around her shoulders, still pale gray blue, caught the light in a way that seemed deliberate, or perhaps telling. Miss Marple's gaze lingered just long enough. "I have discovered several clues," she continued, producing the small scrap of thread she had found on the village green. She held it up, letting it glint in the sunlight streaming through the window. At first glance, a mere thread, but its color and quality are not common. They match an item of clothing worn by one of us, Miss Prudence Hale. Her eyes, calm but unwavering, met Miss Hale's. Miss Hale's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple smiled gently. "You were on the village green yesterday morning, correct, Miss Hale? A fact you initially denied." Miss Hale's fingers twisted tighter around the shawl. I went there to feed the birds. Nothing more." "Feeding the birds does not require carrying a wicker hamper," Miss Marple said quietly, allowing the silence to stretch. "And yet we found that same hamper, used to conceal an item that was taken from the post office ledger earlier this week." The room stirred. Colonel Melrose's brow furrowed. "The ledger! So it was taken by someone in the village." His voice trailed into a low murmur. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Colonel. And the reason, I suspect, was not theft for personal gain, but to protect a secret." The group exchanged glances. Only Miss Hale avoided making eye contact. "Miss Hale," Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly, "that shawl you wear, and the thread left on the green, links you to the scene. But there is more. The ledger contained names and amounts of charitable donations spanning several decades. Your family, you see, has long been responsible for distributing funds discreetly. However, one of the names recently added should not have been there. Someone had sought to exploit the village's goodwill." Miss Hale's face blanched, her hands clutching the fringe of the shawl. "And that is why," Miss Marple continued, "you removed the ledger, to prevent the wrong name from being revealed. Not to steal, but to protect the integrity of your family's work and ultimately the villagers' trust." A soft gasp escaped Mrs. Weatherby. "But, oh, how clever you are, Miss Marple. So it wasn't a crime after all?" "Not in the usual sense," Miss Marple said, "though it created enough confusion to stir suspicion and fear. That is the nature of secrecy." Young Mr. Ellison, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Then, the dragging marks, the whispers in the tunnel, all that was connected to the ledger?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Ellison. Those peculiar occurrences, the tapping, the shadows, were the result of the mansion itself revealing its quirks. Old houses, particularly ones with hidden passages and uneven floors, can create echoes and shadows that seem supernatural. The dragging marks were from a combination of drafts and settled floorboards, as well as the carelessness of the gardener when moving heavy baskets in a hurry." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. The air, heavy for so long, seemed to lift. "But the truth often presents itself in subtle ways," Miss Marple added. the smallest clue, an overlooked thread, a slight misstatement, a hesitant glance, can illuminate what larger events might hide. It is not always the loud, dramatic gestures that solve a mystery. Miss Hale swallowed hard. Her hands shook slightly, releasing the shawl. I didn't mean to frighten anyone," she said softly. "I only wanted to correct an error before it caused trouble." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "And now you have, Miss Hale. There is nothing more to fear." Colonel Melrose, still somewhat skeptical, cleared his throat. "So all of it, the tapping, the whispers, the hidden passages, was natural phenomena?" "Mostly," Miss Marple said, "though in the case of the tunnels one must also consider the effect of imagination on fear. When people expect something uncanny, ordinary events, footsteps, dripping water, creaking boards, appear menacing. This is as true in St. Mary Mead as anywhere else." Mrs. Weatherby dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple, I never realized how much could be learned just by observing so quietly. You make everything seem so manageable." Miss Marple smiled. "The world is always manageable, Mrs. Weatherby. One only needs patience, attention, and a willingness to notice the ordinary. Often it is ordinary things that hide the most extraordinary truths." Miss Hale rose slowly, straightening her back. She gave Miss Marple a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for understanding." "You are quite welcome," Miss Marple replied warmly. "And now we can all return to our usual comfortable routines, though I suspect none of us will view a quiet corridor or a garden green quite the same way again." A gentle knock on the door heralded the arrival of a tray with tea and biscuits placed by the ever-reliable housekeeper. Miss Marple gestured to the group to sit, and soon the room was filled with the warm, comforting aroma of brewed tea. Colonel Melrose poured carefully. "Well, I must admit, Miss Marple, you have once again brought clarity where confusion reigned." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "It is the clarity that is always waiting to be seen, Colonel. One only needs patience." The villagers settled around the table, sipping their tea, exchanging quiet words and reflecting on the unraveled mystery. Outside, the golden leaves of St. Mary Mead shimmered in the sunlight, as if the village itself were breathing a sigh of relief. For the first time in several days, the village felt at ease, and in her chair by the fire, Miss Marple sat back and allowed herself the smallest smile. She had solved another puzzle, not through force or fear, but through observation, gentle persistence, and a belief that even the smallest details could reveal the grandest truths. The mystery of the village green, of the hidden ledger, and of the whispered secrets was finally laid bare. And now, with a quiet house and a village once more at peace, Miss Marple could pour herself a cup of tea and savor the simple comfort of a case well resolved. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Reflections. The sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village green in a soft golden light. Birds trilled cheerfully as if the world itself had decided to return to its ordinary peaceful rhythm. Miss Marple stood at the window of her little cottage, peering out at the dew-kissed grass and tidy gardens. For the first time in several days, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The mystery of the village green had been resolved, the whispers explained, and the ledger safely returned. Yet she knew the most valuable part of any solution lay not only in discovering the truth, but in the lessons it left behind. Inside, her kettle whistled sharply, announcing the readiness of her morning tea. She poured it carefully, watching the steam curl in delicate swirls before settling on the cup. Tea, she thought, was the simplest of comforts, but often the clearest companion to reflection. As she added a teaspoon of sugar and a splash of milk, she allowed her mind to wander back through the events that had so recently filled the village with intrigue. It had begun innocuously, a mysterious wicker hamper on the green, some peculiar dragging marks, and whispers that seemed to echo from the most unlikely corners of the village. Villagers had whispered of shadows in hallways, sounds from the tunnels beneath the old mansion, and photographs that seemed to move across decades. And yet, none of it had been supernatural. Nothing in St. Mary Mead could truly be otherworldly, only misunderstood, misobserved, or misrepresented. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Every subtle gesture, every overlooked clue had mattered. The thread on the green, the careful positioning of the ledger, the peculiarities of Miss Prudence Hale's behavior. All of them had been small, almost imperceptible, yet together they revealed the truth. The ledger had been removed not for theft, but for protection. And the strange occurrences, the shadows, the taps, and the whispered voices, simply the quirks of an old house magnified by imagination and fear. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her reflections. She set down the cup and walked to answer. On the doorstep stood Mrs. Weatherby holding a small tray with a fresh loaf of bread and a selection of buttered scones. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her tone warm and friendly. "I thought you might enjoy a proper breakfast after the past week." Miss Marple smiled, inviting her in. "Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby, that is most kind of you. And I dare say after a week of mysteries, some nourishment is most welcome." They settled at the small round table by the window. Miss Marple poured more tea, the amber liquid reflecting the morning light. Outside, the villagers began their day, children skipping along the lanes, shopkeepers arranging fresh produce, and the vicar strolling toward the church. Life in St. Mary Mead had returned to its natural rhythm just as she always knew it would. "Tell me," Mrs. Weatherby asked, dabbing her lips with a napkin, "did you ever truly think the strange events might be more than ordinary?" Her eyes were wide, curious, tinged with lingering unease. Miss Marple chuckled softly, stirring her tea. "Curiosity is essential, Mrs. Weatherby, but one must always temper it with reason. A house can echo footsteps like someone pacing in the dark. Shadows stretch and warp in the flicker of candlelight. And imagination, well, imagination is both a friend and a foe." The older woman nodded, listening intently. "And yet, without you, Miss Marple, none of us would have understood. I confess I was beginning to worry that something or someone not malevolent had entered our village." "Fear often grows larger than its cause," Miss Marple said calmly. "It is the small details, easily overlooked, that often hold the key. Observe closely, and you will see that the ordinary explains most of what seems extraordinary." A pause settled between them as they sipped tea, the warmth of the cups comforting in their hands. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of fresh flowers from the gardens. The village seemed to breathe in relief, each leaf and petal reflecting the return to normalcy. Miss Marple set down her cup and looked at Mrs. Weatherby thoughtfully. "And now, the village can continue as it always has. The ledger is restored. Miss Hale's intentions are understood, and the mysterious wicker hamper has been accounted for." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "Though I suspect we have all learned something from this, about caution, observation, and the importance of small truths in preventing large misunderstandings." Mrs. Weatherby nodded solemnly, a smile beginning to form. "Indeed. And what about the tunnels beneath the mansion? Will anyone else know of them now?" "They are best left as a secret," Miss Marple said quietly. "For in many cases, some knowledge is meant only for those who can handle it with care. The tunnels are part of the house's history, and their mysteries serve a purpose, reminding us of caution, curiosity, and respect for the ordinary. And occasionally they help remind the living that imagination should never be underestimated." Mrs. Weatherby chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "You always find a way to make things seem comfortable, Miss Marple. Even when they're frightening, you find the balance. Miss Marple smiled, finishing the last sip of her tea. That is because most fears, when examined closely, are not as large as they seem. And most mysteries, when carefully observed, are not as complex as they appear. The ordinary holds the extraordinary if one only looks closely enough. The two women spent the remainder of the morning quietly conversing, their conversation drifting from village gossip to local gardening tips, knitting patterns, and even the upcoming church fete. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over St. Mary Mead. Life resumed gently and naturally, with the comforting knowledge that the village green was once again safe, and that the harmony of everyday life had been restored. Miss Marple lingered for a final moment, gazing out the window. The ledger, the photographs, the whispered warnings, and the mysterious tapping had all found their place in the larger story, resolved, explained, and gently folded back into the ordinary life of the village. And in that quiet reflection she found her own satisfaction, not in danger nor in spectacle, but in the steady, unassuming power of observation, patience, and a warm cup of tea. She rose and placed the empty cup in the sink. The case was closed. The village was safe. And as always, the comforting rhythm of St. Mary Mead would continue quietly and unassumingly, just as life ought to be.